All right. Well, we're trying something new today. This is we're trying something new today. This is the first time that we're attempting the whole live presentation. And today we're going to talk about the coronavirus. Now, public health scares give the government almost unlimited power. Okay. And in quarantine is about the most extreme power the government has over people that have committed no crimes, no offenses. And this goes all the way back to the early 1800s, 1824, Gibbons v. Ogden. Okay. Nearly unlimited local power to quarantine. Now, coming back forward in the 1900s, the power of the states to act and enforce quarantine laws for the safety and protection, health of their inhabitants is beyond question. So the government has the authority to enact quarantines, to enact isolation, and there's a whole list of laws, and we're going to go through those a little bit here today. We're going to talk about them and what impacts those have. Now, I've never done a live broadcast before, so I'm not expecting that there are going to be many people that actually log in to watch. I'm hoping that there will, and most of you are probably going to watch this as a replay of the recording. This is completely live. I'm going to be pulling the research up while we are talking. So let's talk about what the government can do, okay? You've heard about the anti-vaccination folks. People believe that a lot of vaccinations contain things that are harmful to you. And in most ordinary times, you can refuse vaccinations. You can make your own health decisions. However, during a public health scare, during a public health crisis, where we have orders from the president via executive order, the government can prevent travel. Let me turn the audio off on this computer. The government can prevent travel. It can require vaccinations. It can make you submit to medical exams. It can even commandeer private property and lock you up. People who are sick, people who are not sick can be ordered into quarantine and isolation. They can be confined to their home or to another location. You've seen on the news, I'm sure, people have been transported to Nebraska and put in a camp in Nebraska, a very nice camp with private rooms. They don't see anybody. They're isolated. They're away from their family. Those people have committed no crimes. Now, one of the things that you have to look at is what is for the greater good. I would like to think that if I was exposed to a potentially deadly pathogen that could kill a lot of people, that I would agree to isolate myself for protection of my family, my friends, my community. However, the government can force that. And that's where we get into, do they really force everybody that needs to? Do they let people go? Our public health scares tend to be bludgeons. It's clubs, not scalpels. We're not as worried about the minimum invasive procedure as we are stopping the health scare. So where do we go and what are we looking at? And that's what we're going to get into today. Now, most people don't understand who actually has the authority to order public health measures such as putting you into isolation, quarantine, locking things down, making you have vaccinations, making you have a medical exam. Those are actually authority. That is actually authority granted to public health officials either via state or federal law and by the President of the United States. So while the Constitution tolerates that restriction to your liberties for a limited time during a true public health emergency, those constitutional protections exist, and you have those protections. However, in reality, those protections are much more limited. They're very attenuated to what they would be normally. First, you can't see anybody. So when you're in isolation, when you're in quarantine, your ability to exercise your constitutional rights is significantly limited. Those guards guarding quarantine facilities with weapons and live ammunition, they're not keeping people out. So we're not going to get into how you conduct that constitutional fight from quarantine today. That is a very complicated area of law, and quite frankly, I'm just not prepared to have that discussion. But we are going to get into and talk about what the actual laws regarding quarantine and the government's ability to implement that and isolate you. So the CDC is not in control of quarantines or isolation or even the response. Okay. Neither is the federal government. This is really a state. Now, the federal government does have control at the borders, at the national borders, not the state borders. And if you've ever traveled, like, say to Mexico, you might have noticed that when you're driving back from Mexico, they have border patrol checkpoints, 80, 100 miles inland. That's in that border zone. And there's a lot on YouTube. If you want to have a day and get really, really pissed off, go back and watch that. Good morning. Agricultural inspections. Okay. We can talk about that in just a minute. There's a lot that the federal government can do. However, what they're trying to do is stop the contaminant, stop the coronavirus from coming into the country. They're going to do inspections. They're going to do that on everything. Ags. Frankly, it's going to be crushing to our economy. And that's not going to be good. Now, would those be the state lockdown area? B has posted in a comment, it could be. And this is where we're going to rapidly exceed my scope of knowledge as far as what they might actually do. I'm an attorney in Kirksville, Missouri. I don't have the plans for the national response to this. We're focusing mainly on what quarantine is and why they can impose it, and frankly, where they can impose that at the moment. Right now, we have a limited number of cases in the United States. That limited number is mostly coming in through the national border. There's one case in California that they've not been able to locate how that person was exposed, but it was not through travel to a foreign country. So while we are frankly over preparing, the government is rightly terrified. Okay, when you talk about the death capacity of these illnesses, and I'm going to steal from a friend of mine on Facebook who had done a little bit of research on this and made a very well-informed post. An attorney here in Missouri named David Rowland is phenomenal. And he did a short post on his Facebook page regarding this just 2 days ago. And I'm going to read from that briefly. Now, Mr. Rowland asserted that the COVID-19 outbreak, we've not said much because, frankly, there hasn't been a lot to say. The worst seasonal flu episodes recently were the 2014-15 season, 2017-18 season. In 2014-15, there were roughly 30 million symptomatic cases in the United States, and CDC estimated about 51,000 deaths. That's a case fatality rate of 17/100%. In 2017, 2018, there were roughly 45 million symptomatic cases in the U.S., and the CDC estimated approximately 61,000 deaths, which is a 13/100% fatality rate. Okay, right now there's approximately 330 million people living in the United States, and if they all got it for the 2014, 2015 version of the flu, that would have caused a 561,000 deaths nationwide. Now, as comparison, the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 had a case fatality rate of more than 2.5%. That's many, many more times deadly than the seasonal flu we've seen in the past half century. Now, that was the deadliest pandemic in history, killing as many as 50 million people worldwide. In perspective, if every one of the 330 million people living in the United States got the 1918, 1919 flu, it likely would cause 8.25 million deaths nationwide. If everyone in the world, we could be looking in the more than 180, 185 million deaths. Now, I don't think that would happen now because our medical technology is much, much better than it was then. So we shouldn't be overreacting to COVID-19, but it is right that we are concerned because the potential death rate is so significantly high. And marijuana is a farm commodity under federal law, is exempt from any form of taxation until processed. Well, I'm not a tax lawyer, and we don't have a value-added tax in the United States. But I would say if the farmer is selling it unprocessed, then income tax would be liable at that time. Now, if the farmer is processing and then selling the processed marijuana, then that's a different story. But that would be my take on that. So turning back to what they can and cannot do for quarantine. First, let's define our terms. Isolation is separating sick people with a quarantinable communicable disease from people who are not sick. That is forcibly saying you're going to stay here and everybody who isn't sick is going to be over here. Quarantine separates and restricts the movement of people who were exposed to a disease to see whether or not they're sick. So you isolate the sick people, you quarantine the people you just don't know about. Now, in addition to serving the medical functions of isolation and quarantine, those are police powers. And the reason the federal government can do that is that's part of the police power and community caretaking function, public health. Now, the federal government is claiming its authority out of this from the Commerce Clause, which is the most overused clause in the U.S. Constitution. Under Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act, that's 42 U.S.C. 264, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is authorized to take measures to prevent the entry and spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries into the United States and between the several states. So the authority of carrying that out on a daily basis is designated to the federal government under federal law to prevent entry into the country and between the states via the Commerce Clause. Now, that's been delegated by the federal government to the CDC, and the CDC is operating under 42 Code of Federal Regulations, and apparently I can't even speak today. That's cool. Parts 70 and 71. The CDC is authorized to detain, medically examine, and release persons arriving into the United States and traveling between the states, which are suspected of carrying these communicable diseases. Now, there's a list. And when they say between the states, the federal government has no authority to restrain your movement from Northern California to Southern California. The federal government has no authority to restrain your movement from St. Louis to Kansas City. The state of Missouri could do that, but the federal government cannot. Okay, it's outside the federal government's purview. Now, will they? Yeah, look, governments overreach all the time. They sure as hell might, but they don't have the constitutional authority to do that. However, what will happen is the federal government will tell the state government to do this, and the state government's going to do it. So understand, while the feds may not have the authority to do it themselves, they certainly have the power to tell the state to do it, and the state has the authority. Now, the states have police power functions to protect the health, safety, and welfare of persons within their borders. Now, that's state, local, tribal authorities all have that. Now, to control that spread, the states can use isolation, quarantine. They can lock you down, keep you in your homes. Those movies where you saw people that were told you had to stay in your home, you couldn't leave your home, and drastic penalties if you did. That's not far wrong. If it got that bad, that could be done. So the states will take action on state law, and they may do it at the direction of the federal government and with the guidance of the CDC. So when you look at who's in charge, well, the feds are in charge to stop entry of disease into the United States. Okay, they can use quarantine and isolation at ports of entry. They can move people from the port of entry to a designated point like they have in Nebraska. They will take those actions, and they can. Now, they can take actions to stop the spread of disease between the states, and they may accept and require state and local assistance in enforcing quarantines. So then the states can do the same thing in the state at the state level. Now, there's coexisting and co-equal powers, and I don't know if we really need to get into separation of powers. If somebody really wants me to, we can talk about that. So the enforcement that can be used is isolation, quarantine, and if it's federal, there will be a quarantine order issued. That quarantine order, I actually have a copy of the sample here. Then it starts at the top. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, order for quarantine under Section 361 Public Health Service Act, 42 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 70 interstate and Part 71 foreign. Medical marijuana is medicine and should be paid fully by medical insurance. There is definitely something to that. And after I run through this, I will talk about that here in just a few minutes, because I think that's an important thing. Section A, the subject person who, and they have the name of the person, was determined to have been in Hubei province, People's Republic of China in the last 14 days, who was on board blank airline flight arriving at blank airport. And they run through the legal justifications to put that person into quarantine and into isolation as needed. You're going to be restricted there. And it looks like people are wanting to talk about agriculture. So I will skip forward to that, and I'll probably modify the title of this a little bit. But if you are looking for information on what the quarantine laws are, what they can do, the penalties for violating quarantine laws, which I probably ought to touch on before I shift to another subject. That's, again, it's Title 42, United States Code, Section 271. Any person who violates any regulation prescribed under Sections 264 to 266 of this title, or Provision 269 of this title, or any regulation prescribed thereunder, or who enters or departs from the limits of any quarantine station, ground, or anchorage in disregard of quarantine rules and regulations, or without the permission of the quarantine officer in charge, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $1,000 or by imprisonment for not more than 1 year, or both. Penalties for vessels, we won't talk about that. Remittance or mitigation of forfeitures. It's pretty serious. If you violate the quarantine, they can throw your ass in prison for a year, fine you $1,000. But, that's, do you want to stay in a camp where everybody's getting sick? That's another question. I don't know. All right. So if you're interested in reading more on this, there's a great deal on the CDC website, cdc.gov/quarantine/specific laws and regulations. They've got excerpts from 42 USC for quarantine and all the various codes and code of federal regulations. And to avoid turning this into one of Mr. French's videos, I'm not going to read all those. But I will address Mr. Woods Alfalfa's comments on medical marijuana. Yes, medical marijuana is most definitely medicine. The question that you're going to have there is, until it is off the federal schedule, until it is no longer a Schedule I drug, doctors cannot prescribe it. So while it has a lot of beneficial medical effects, there cannot be a prescription for medical marijuana, and medical insurance may not be able to be forced to pay for that. However, if you have a health savings plan, there's a very real argument for using your health savings plan funds to pay for your medical marijuana, because your health savings plan money can be used for bandages, it can be used for other items, and that makes a pretty big difference. Let's see. So I hope that helps you there, Mr. Woods Alfalfa. I don't know if you're going to get medical insurance that will pay, but a health savings plan could probably be required to do that. I would have to see the actual plan documents, but there's an argument there. Now, there's also a lot of discussion about what's been going on in Jefferson City lately. You may have heard about a little conversation they've been having to modify the Constitution and start restricting access to medical marijuana. That's going to be a problem for them for a number of reasons. First, medical marijuana, the constitutional amendment that we have, our Constitution now, Article 14, prohibits the legislature from enacting any unreasonable restrictions on access to your medical marijuana. Now, telehealth is something that we've been promoting for a long, long time, especially in rural areas, and especially for people that have health conditions that limit their ability to hike all over the frickin' planet. Going to a doctor can be difficult when you are in a rural area. So there is a constitutional argument that they're missing. And it would be my hope that someone is going to cobble together the ability to fight that. I don't know exactly when that will happen, but it likely will. We also have an argument coming up for full legalization that will likely be on the ballot this fall. One of my concerns is that is going to operate, and we're going to get that approved the same way as the medical marijuana, where it's going to encapsulate the entire program in the hands of a few wealthy companies and prevent average Missourians from being able to start a farm in their backyard. It will be nice if it gets to the point where we can see people able to grow their own free from threat of arrest. but that is getting way, way, way away from the subject we started this on. I don't know if I should end the stream and start a different one and talk about medical marijuana, or honestly, I don't know the etiquette for live streaming. Changing subjects in live stream, is that acceptable or is that inappropriate? Let me know. Say something. So when we look at what we have coming down for the bills, there's HB 2715 that is allegedly going to establish provisions for family court participants that also participate in medical marijuana. And right now, look, that's not happening, guys. If you're not following this, people are not being allowed to use medical marijuana when they're on probation, if they're in family court, if they're in family drug court, because there are a lot of questions. People, we just aren't really sure how it's going to break down. We don't know how the courts are going to order. And by and large, a lot of courts have taken the opinion that because you have a medical marijuana card doesn't mean that they can't restrict your ability to use it. One judge I was talking to compared it to the court's ability to restrict you from using alcohol, which is a legal substance, and restrict your ability from using certain types of drug medication that could very well be prescribed. However, the discussion I had with that judge is there's a difference between alcohol and OxyContin, or alcohol and Vicodin, or alcohol and any other prescribed drug. And that difference is you don't have a constitutional right to use those drugs and that substance. In Missouri, you have a constitutional right to use medical marijuana, which poses a much higher standard. So that's one of the things that has to be sorted out, and we're not there yet. Hopefully we'll get there, but we're not there yet. So this bill that has been proposed, House Bill 2715, that will address the use of medical marijuana by people that are in the family court program. Family court participant requires treatment for a qualified medical condition in accordance with Article 14, Constitution of Missouri. Family court shall not prohibit such participant from participating in Missouri's medical marijuana program. Family court participant shall not be required to refrain from using medical marijuana as a term or condition of successful completion of the family court program. Family court participant that is a qualified patient with a valid medical marijuana certificate in accordance with Article 14, the the Constitution of Missouri, shall not be in violation of terms or conditions of family court on the basis of his or her participation. The status and conduct of qualified patient who acts in accordance with Article 14 of the Constitution of Missouri shall not by itself be used to restrict or abridge custodial parental rights to minor children in any action proceeding under the jurisdiction of the family court under this chapter or juvenile court under Chapter 211. The use of marijuana is a subject that comes up in family law all the time. It's an easy attack on the other party if you know they smoke weed occasionally, or if you know that they have a medical card, and they make that attack because, they're using marijuana, so they're in a drug condition. And if one of the catchphrases you'll hear if you ever are involved in family court is parenting under the influence. That's considered to be a very bad thing. If you're parenting under the influence, you are not in the stable mind to render that decisions that you will need to make as a parent, thereby placing your child at risk. So, and yes, before you castigate me, I'm not saying that is my belief. I'm saying that this is what the situation is. I think people parent under the influence all the time to varying degrees of success, whether you have a back problem and a pain pump for it, or if you have a patient card and you're using medical marijuana or something. The question is are you intoxicated, or are you so under influence that you're no longer able to make reasonable, rational decisions and no longer able to exercise your authority and responsibility in an appropriate manner? That is the arguments we made as attorneys representing parents, that's what the thing means, not just whether or not you have consumed any marijuana. And of course, whether or not you've consumed marijuana has nothing to do with intoxication by marijuana, because they can't prove it. There's no way to prove intoxication. We don't have schedules like you do for alcohol. We don't have the studies that say you are intoxicated if you've had 3 grams of marijuana in the last hour. We just don't know. It affects everybody differently, and the uptakes are different because it's different body chemistry. And we've not done the research on that because it's a Schedule I drug and the feds won't let us. So yeah, this is a good bill. House Bill 2715 is a good step. It's saying that, hey, just because you're in family court doesn't mean you should be able to be told you can't use medical marijuana. The obvious and unstated assumption is that if you're not using medical marijuana, you're going to be on a much harsher opiate or other drug that could have worse effects, and not to mention being much more expensive. So that's actually not a bad bill. That's a good bill. That's one that you should probably support. Now, there are a number of things that are being promoted. Even the bill that nobody really likes right now regarding the telehealth, there are good parts of that bill as well, but it's probably going to get thoroughly condemned because of the bad parts. So we just hit a half hour, which is going to be the limit for this first live stream, mainly because I'm still learning how to do this. If there's something that you want us to address or you think we should target going forward, please let me know. I send an email to Pat@PatTalksLaw. Yeah, that House bill is going to be, it's not going to do well. Eliminating telehealth, House Bill 1896. There are a lot of people that are very, very upset by that, and I can see the concerns. Let's face it, if you are not politically active, if you do not get involved, and now the legislature is going to take your rights away. They will do what they want to do. You have to be active, you have to be loud, and you have to step up. That's just part of the, thanks, Matt. That's part of what you're looking at right now in our society. There is nothing about our society that is making it safe for the average everyday citizen to ignore politics and what's going on around them. Back in the 80s, man, Bruce Springsteen did a rendition of War that was phenomenal. I loved it. In 1984, blind faith in your leaders or in anything will get you killed. Quoting Springsteen. Well, brother, that was 1984, and it hadn't gotten any better. It's gotten much worse. We have not had a year of peace since 1984. We have been in armed conflict somewhere, and that's our nation state in armed conflict somewhere. We have had troops in combat since 2001 in as many as 7 different countries. President Obama got a peace prize, and he invaded more countries than fucking Hitler did. We put more troops on the ground in more countries during President Obama's presidency than Hitler did. Think about that. That should scare the ever-loving shit out of you. And meanwhile, while we are enforcing our will in all these countries around the world, we're telling average everyday citizens that you cannot smoke weed. Hell, if you're 20 years old, you can't go smoke a cigarette. It's ridiculous. But meanwhile, we can take that same 20-year-old, put a rifle in his hand, and send him somewhere else to enforce our will on their country. You wonder why the rest of the world hates us. I got news for you. That's why. We need to stay out of their damn business. Okay, I'm going to get out of that. Look, you get into politics, people get going. But if you don't pay attention to politics, you don't pay attention to politics around medical marijuana, you are going to lose what you have fought for. So you need to pay attention to Jeff City. You need to pay attention to what they're doing, and you need to be ready to fight and pay attention to the national scene. Our Constitution and our constitutional amendment here in Missouri is going to be next to meaningless if we don't stop the feds, if we don't change the federal law. Any president can change the approach of the federal government and say, we're going to start enforcing federal law and we're going to shut down all these state dispensaries. Okay, that's simply an executive decision. It's not a congressional decision, it's the executive. So that's something that is going to impact us. So, well, hey, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to log off now. We will do another live show. It'll probably wind up being a Saturday thing. And feel free to send anything you think we should address during this. And I think we're probably going to be less a directed subject and more follow the pattern of what people are saying they want to talk about, because that's more seems to have a better flow for this. And yes, it is my intent that these will be uploaded to the channel. I'm going to tell you, I'm working through it. So, excuse me, you may have seen, the occasional thing popping up last night as we were trying to learn how to do this. But yeah, it will be uploaded. And all right, well, thank you. And I'm going to end this stream and save it to the channel, so it should be available here momentarily.